Agile.FM, radio for the Agile community. www.agile.fm. Hello listeners, I'm here with Jason Little, a lean coach, an agile coach with Lean Dog and Lean Into It, depending on where he is, either United States or in his home country, Canada, Toronto to be exact. Welcome to the podcast, Jason.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Jason, you are the agilecoach.ca and I'm the agilecoach.com. So here are the two domain names, agile coaches talking to each other. Well, no, you're on agilecoach.ca, and when you go to that website, you actually see a new book you have released. It's called Lean Change, and this book is all about lean. There's no agile in the title, and it's all about organizational change. There's actually a sample chapter on your website people can read through and get familiar with the topic. But I want to use this podcast here, just this conversation, just to get the listeners acquainted with this topic, and maybe you just want to share a little bit about what this book is all about and what people could take away with it.
Sure. So this book is really about trying to build a bridge between the Agile community and the organizational development and change management communities. I think there's a lot that Agile practitioners can learn about change management and organizational change from that community, and vice versa. I think, at least from some of the companies that I've talked to who do change management and organizational development could benefit from some of the Agile practices. So the book is about how to come up with a set of more innovative practices for managing how change is introduced in organizations. In my background, that's typically through the introduction of Agile practices, which is I see that more of a trigger for a change as opposed to a destination. So the book talks about a bunch of different practices from the lean startup world, from the Agile world, from the change management world, from neuroscience and human behavior as well, to help change practitioners kind of have a more well-rounded toolkit to be able to manage change within organizations.
So why lean change? Why not just change? What's so special about it?
Well, the title is Lean Change Management: Innovative Practices for Managing Organizational Change. And the term lean change came from a guy named Jeff Anderson. So I worked with him a couple of years ago, and it was about applying lean practices to change. So the direction that my book has gone has largely been more into lean plus change management, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So from what I've seen in the traditional community is that a lot of the change management models, they're kind of linear in their thinking, and they focus on how can we come up with a perfect plan in isolation and then unleash it on the organization and then blame those resistors when they don't do what the plan says. A lot of literature in the change management world talks about how 70% of change initiatives fail, which I don't take a lot of stock in because I think organizational change is too complex to put a binary success or fail metric on it. So using lean plus change management is, sometimes you have to feel your way through a change. You can't plan everything up front because of how today's organizations are so complex. And a seemingly small change can have some large ripple effects. So how can you think smaller? How can you apply lean practices to figure out small experiments to run and focus on how can you validate whether or not the change you were doing got you the outcome you wanted versus trying to plan all that stuff up front. So primary audience for me is people in change management and organizational development, and a secondary audience would be Agile practitioners. So using the lean word is kind of intentional to attract people from the more traditional world, to get them to think differently about change.
Well, so here's a change model you describe in your in that chapter you're providing for free on your website. People can get familiar with that sample chapter. The change model, I'm just reading it out because I don't want to get it wrong, but it's basically it's a 5-step process, basically a status quo, resistance, chaos, integration, and then there's a new status quo.
Yeah. So that's based on that's based on the Virginia Satir change model, and that's something that I learned through PSL and AYE, which are experiential conferences put on by Jerry Weinberg and Esther Derby, Johanna Rothman, Don Gray, and Steve Smith. And that was a pretty big turning point for me, because up until that point, I think I'm going back to about 2008 or so, I was taking more of a process expert approach. So I got my certified Scrum Master, and I was very proud, because back then there weren't a lot of options. And then I realized, after going to that first experiential conference that's heavily based on Satir, that it's really got very little to do with Agile, and a whole lot more to do with how people process change. So that model specifically talks about a foreign element is the actual change itself. So it's something that is, comes from the outside, or something I invoke. And in an organization, Agile is a pretty massive foreign element that gets thrown into the existing organization. As a result, the organization spirals into chaos, and then they hit what is called the transforming idea, where they kind of get it, and then they integrate these new ideas into their new identity, and then they arrive at the new status quo.
Right.
The tricky part is people and teams are all going through that curve at different rates and different intensities. We're not moving as one cohesive organization, which is why we get some people that are just run like gangbusters with these new Agile practices, and you get people that fight to preserve the status quo because that's what they value as a person. So it's important to understand that when bringing change in.
So there's certain things are affected, and the ones you're highlighting here are feelings, thought, performance, even physiology is affected. Do you have some examples for that? How this all ties together, and based on your experiences?
Okay, so I would say that when change is brought in and it doesn't work out, like looking at the version 1 Agile survey and some of the other change management surveys, they cite resistance to change. So to me, that is like saying, I have no idea why it didn't work, but those bad people resisted change, which is why it didn't work. This model explains that if I'm a project manager who's got 15 years of experience running $1 million projects, and now some consultant is going to come in and tell me I have to do Agile because it's better, I've prided myself on coming up with good plans, and my projects have worked, and I like certainty. I don't like variance. I am naturally going to exhibit symptoms as being a resistor to change, because for me, Agile seems like chaos. It seems like no planning and no documentation. So I'm going to just physically react in a way. My body language is going to be affected at stand-up meetings and when I'm talking about it. So there's lots of other things going on for people that Satir model really, for me, helps me understand why I see some of the reactions I do, and then I can inquire about that.
Yeah. So you can tell from the body language, like what phase they're in terms of the change.
Yep. I had a really good team that I worked with a number of years ago, and one of the guys in the team was, I'd mess up the video if I exhibited the behavior, but he was kind of in the stand-up. He was kind of looking around and not really paying attention, and you just knew this wasn't sitting well with him. So I pulled him aside and then just asked him. I said, "This seems like it's really hard for you. What's going on?" And he said that being forced to stand there reporting status reminded him of being in the Army. He just didn't like it. And I said, "Well, what if we just sat down?" And he said, "Well, are we allowed to do that? Like, Scrum says we have to stand up." I'm like, "No, it's our team. The whole point is just to plan your day. The reason why teams stand up is because it keeps the meeting short. But if we can agree to sit down and still be done in 15, 20 minutes, and we can have our day planned, awesome. So how about we propose this to the team?" And that was a very motivating thing for him. His behavior completely changed from then on, because he felt some ownership, and he felt like he wasn't being forced to do something.
All right. He felt like ownership over his own environment and destiny of the process.
Oh, could you repeat that one? Sorry, I didn't catch that one.
That felt like it was his destiny, the process. He could influence the process because he was part of it. He wasn't told. He wasn't told what to do in that particular situation. Your book is
Yeah.
about organizational change, and you mentioned that a few times already in our conversations about organizations. What's so special about, applying change to an individual person versus an entire organization? What kind of dimension comes into this mix? Obviously, it's got to be something because
Hmm.
it's bigger in size.
Yeah. For me, it's about understanding that culture question. So a lot of times when Agile is brought in, it's you have to develop the Agile mindset and you have to change your culture, etc. And for me, the culture it's a collection of the interactions and the behaviors of all the individuals
Mm-hmm.
is what makes culture emerge. People that have a different set of values than what I might have.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked in some organizations that they value process, so they
Mm-hmm.
see Agile as a way to optimize their process. My personal stance is yes, I think the mindset and culture is extremely important, but in those instances, it's not the right message for that organization.
Mm-hmm.
It's counter to their existing culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to understand the personalities of the people who are involved in the change and what it means for them, and take more of an empathetic approach as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to, trying to hit them over the head with the Agile stick, so to speak.
Right. So how you spend your days is coaching and helping consulting companies in lean change. And how does a typical day look for you, if there is even such a thing as a typical day outside of
Mm.
the training environment, like the coaching side? What is it? What are the things people maybe struggle with? Maybe you spend a lot of time on in this kind of organizational change.
I think the hardest thing I've heard from people who have tried some of these ideas with is I like to call it a feedback driven approach to change.
Mm-hmm.
And they struggle with typically, people who are responsible for bringing change in have to come up with some type of plan because they're the subject matter experts. And they have a hard time figuring out how to create a feedback driven plan.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I just came from a meeting recently, as in 10 minutes ago, where we were talking about this. So we had created what's called a change canvas a number of months ago, and it's basically a strategy for the vision here is to be a product development organization that can deliver solutions in 6 months or less, as opposed to a project-focused organization. So this canvas paints a vision and a strategy and some measurements for how we feel we're going to be successful. And the change team was starting to come up with a whole bunch of things to do. Well, we need to develop this training program. We need to develop this. We need to develop that. And then I asked them the question, well, how do you know those are the right changes to do? And just dead silence. And that's the whole key behind lean change management is co-creating the change by involving the people who are affected by the change in the design of it. And that's a hard thing for practitioners, change practitioners, to get their heads around because they're the ones who are the experts that are supposed to be coming up with the change. And they usually have a deadline and a budget. So, we can't possibly get feedback from people to input into this plan because we have to get it done by next week.
Right.
Well, then your change isn't going to work. So I'm working also with a Fortune 100 company remotely, helping them with some of these ideas. And early on, that was their hardest point to get around was, what does this feedback-driven approach to change mean? And how can we do it? So I worked with them for a couple of hours every other week by doing a study group on the first version of my book. And then it was actually 2 weeks ago when they finally got it. They said, oh, we get what that means now. It means we're facilitating change. We're not managing it. We're not controlling it. We're trying to allow the right changes to emerge based on where we're headed as an organization. I'm like, bingo, that's exactly it.
Right.
That's the hardest thing.
Yeah. Does that include like meta question? Is it more like, instead of going in with prescribed approaches, like as you mentioned, the training material, like the certain things about change, but actually asking the questions about the program, the meta questions? That's what you're referring to? Okay, just want to clarify.
Definitely the meta questions for sure. Because a lot of change models, they're linear in their nature, and the change consulting firms that come in, like you bring these big firms in to implement Agile or implement a change. Of course, they have a recipe to follow. That's what big companies do.
Right.
We don't want to follow the recipe.
Yeah.
Like a chef would, as opposed to applying the same linear prescriptive formula to introducing change.
Right. So in your sample chapter, actually, you, I don't know if have you ever done a creme brulee? Have you ever?
I've had it, but I've never tried to make one myself.
It's
I've had a burnt one before,
yes,
so I assume that was very bad. But
it's not easy.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
And
yeah.
but you're referring to the creme brulee, and as a thing, it's like it's almost like there's so many parameters who make a successful creme brulee or not. But how does your toolkit, the actual toolkit of lean change and the innovative approach, can you give like an example of how to help organizations? What would be one of those examples of a toolkit or an element of the toolkit for people to apply? Is there any kind of example you have?
Okay. So one of the tools comes from a professor named BJ Fogg, and he has a behavior model that talks about, in order for change, like individual change to happen, there's two levers. One of the levers is ability, and one is motivation. We always look at motivation. Mm-hmm. So there's tens of millions of blog posts around how to motivate people and how to mastery, autonomy, purpose are the only things that matter, and we can't use the carrot and stick method. It's always motivation, motivation, motivation. Mm-hmm. But one of his models is, well, ability is there as well. If a change is really hard to do, all the motivation in the world is not going to allow that change to happen. Okay. There has to be some ability. And he says, if ability is low and motivation is high, what you need to do is you need to facilitate that change. You need to somehow make that change easier. Mm-hmm. Whereas, and that might be me as a coach. I go sit with the team for a week, and I work with them as a team member mm-hmm. to show them. And the opposite is if motivation is low, but ability is high. So if you go into a team that has lots of experience in a particular domain, and they're a high-performing team, they just might not be aware of a practice like behavior-driven development. Mm-hmm. So he calls that sparking motivation. So all you need to do is you need to make them aware that there's a better way to do something, and they'll be like, oh, cool, let me go read a book and let's go try it. Mm-hmm. And they'll do it. And that's two drastically different approaches for how a change agent could implement a change within an organization. So I like to use that model a lot and kind of map out all the different types of changes that I'm doing with the change team and look at the differences. Like, which of these are really hard to do? Mm-hmm. We might not want to do these right now.
Right.
How many different departments do we have to cut across to implement a new funding model to support product teams instead of project teams? Mm. Let's not fight that battle. Let's just let our teams who are siloed deliver stuff faster with better quality. Mm-hmm. And Agile would throw me out of the club and take my badge away for saying something like that. But that's the reality of where they're at, Yeah. The approach of delivering crap faster might be the best approach for now. Then let's worry about building the right thing. Let's mm-hmm. not try and build the right thing the right way right from the start, because it might not fit in their environment. So mm-hmm. I like that behavioral model.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting element in your toolbox. I love it. It's great. It's a great example. You do mention a lot of organizational change, and sometimes you leave the lean off. And I know that you always look at other than lean kind of organizational change. Obviously, there's a long history of change management in general, and there's a lot of input and results you could tap into, obviously, from a lean's perspective, just in terms of change control as a whole. What kind of things influence you from the traditional world? Is there anything out there which you feel like we shouldn't just ignore all of that stuff? There's some really good things there.
The one I like the most is probably from Kurt Lewin, who is credited as being kind of the father of change management. So he has what is called a force field analysis. Mm-hmm. Which I like to use when I am helping align teams with an overall change strategy, which is bring the strategy to the team and let the team call shenanigans on it, and let the team write down what in the organization is working against this change and what is supporting it, and then how can we contribute to it. I don't really talk about the models at all. I just use those types of questions. Like, I don't talk about what's the urgency for the change, because that's not the right question. Urgency is going to emerge from the conversations that happen. So if I can get them thinking about, you know what, our VPs want us to go agile and do this, what would be in our way? Which is the negative part of the force field analysis. And then what would be supporting it? And then bring that feedback back to the VPs to have them revise the strategy based on input from the teams. So I think that's one of the ones I like the most. I also like the McKinsey 7S framework, which is one of the least popular from my research in the traditional world, because it really speaks to how interconnected today's organizations are. It's not a linear model. It says if you change any one of the 7 dimensions, all other 6 are affected. Whereas, something like ProSize AdCar is very linear. It says start up your project, create a plan, implement the plan, close down the project. Well, change doesn't work that way. So I like, so those 2 are probably my favorite, the McKinsey 7S and Kurt Lewin's force field, because they really talk about the dynamic nature of change and how you can't predict how it's going to unfold.
Right. So what I'm hearing, old is not necessarily bad. Old does not necessarily mean it doesn't work with lean and agile and so on. There's a nice marriage between those things, but use them carefully. Not everything applies directly to the way how we think in the agile and in the lean world.
Yeah.
Right. So your book provides that kind of guideline, and would put only toolkits in, which may be coming from the past or from older traditional methods, but combined now with a lean spin. Yeah.
It's very much like Jürgen Apollo's Management 3.0, where he calls it the Mojito method. So by taking models and ideas from many different communities and combining them into a new model, it's more effective than those individual ideas. So that's kind of the general idea behind it. I talk a little bit about Kotter's 8 steps as well in the book, which I think is pretty popular in Agile circles.
Absolutely.
But it's not a step-by-step process.
Yeah.
I think some people fall into that trap of we need to finish step 1, which is create urgency.
Yeah.
Then we need to move on to step 2, which is create the coalition, which was not his intent.
Yeah.
I use those 8 steps more as a checklist. Here's 8 ingredients that help build a successful change program. Make sure you're addressing each of them. But tactically, you build urgency by, running a lean coffee session. You get VPs and staff in a room together for an hour, having an open, honest dialogue that contributes to the creation of urgency. So things like that.
Wonderful. It's really wonderful, and I have to say, I myself got a little bit appetite for more. I'm gonna reach out to more of your writing. I'm gonna visit you absolutely on Agile.coach.ca. There's this book. This is just brand new, right? It's just recently published, 2014.
The first edition I published about a year ago. I released it through LeanPub, so I actually did validation that people wanted these ideas. This is the second edition that's being released through Happy Melody Express. So it's a complete rewrite, and it's going to come out with a bunch of other supporting material, tutorials, and Canvas ideas and things like that.
Perfect.
And leanchange.org is the site where you can get more information specifically about the book and sign up to get chapters.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. And also your Twitter handle, Jason Little. You got that one? Perfect. And people can connect with you and start a dialogue about change, lean change.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And explaining a little bit your thoughts and ideas behind your book. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to Agile.FM, the radio for the Agile community. I'm your host, Joe Krebs. If you're interested in more programming and additional podcasts, please go to www.agile.fm. Talk to you soon.